Great. Welcome everyone. It's just getting up to the right time to start. So we will start or at least start with the introductions, and hopefully as people are joining into this session, but also the live stream, people will start getting and we'll start the discussion fully. So welcome everyone to the Writing Academic Seminar Series for 2022, and this particular one, which is called Writing for Different Audiences. My name is Gunjan Sondhi, and I'm a lecturer in geography at the Open University UK. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating the discussion today, and we have
recording in progress.
Apologies for that. We have two incredible speakers and discussants rather, and we are absolutely honoured and delighted to have Mara Asis and Jonathan Rigg, who will be speaking with us and discussing and sharing their experiences with us, as well as the wider audience around how to write for different audiences. So firstly, we have Mara Asis, who is a director at the Scalarbini Migration Center, which is based in Manila, Philippines. My apologies, slip of tongue. She is a sociologist with more than 30 years of research experience on international migration and social transformations in Asia. Her research publications explore the themes of gender, family, and migration and development, and migration governance. She is currently working on a study of reintegration experiences of Filipino migrant workers, which were repatriated during the COVID-19 pandemic. So very timely, and continues on engaging with her wider body of work around social change within Asia. She is also the editor of the Asia Pacific Migration Journal, and she has served as mentor to member of various expert groups, advisory committees, and scientific committees on policy, research, advocacy issues related to international migration. So welcome, Marla, and we're looking forward to your discussions and your sharing the experiences with the audience today. Our second speaker is Jonathan Rigg, and Jonathan is a professor of human geography at Bristol University in the UK and was the former director of Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He has written and published with scholars based in Australia, Canada, Laos, Nepal, New Zealand, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Vietnam, so quite a broad geographic focus in terms of his collaborations that he's had. He has served on editorial boards of journals based in, again, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea, so quite a spectrum of Southeast and East Asia, as well as Europe, UK, and the US. His books have been published by Amsterdam University Press, Cambridge University Press, Hawaii University Press, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, as well as Oxford University Press. And his research focuses broadly on the development challenges in the Asian region, and especially on matters of rural development based in, again, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and today they have kindly agreed to share their experiences and thoughts, as well as Europe, UK, drawing on their established research and their work in the past to really share how to write for different audiences, and his research for academic scholarly work, or whether it's policy-oriented, solution-oriented publication that you might be doing, and what are some of the considerations you need to take, or that we all need to keep in mind as we produce our research outputs in this very particular, very specific way of writing, as opposed to all the other exciting and creative ways that we have. But today the focus is purely on writing. How to write for different and his research, I'm sure we can have a different session on it. But today, so without any further considerations you need to take, or that we will start the discussion as we give everyone a sense of how research outputs in this very particular, very specific way of writing, as opposed to all the other exciting and creative ways that we have. But today the focus is purely on writing. And they have and his research, I'm sure we can have a different session. And then the second half of the session, the next 45 minutes, is time for Q&A, where we're really hoping that the audience or that we will start to keep in mind that we raise if you have any other further very particular, very specific way of writing, as opposed to all the other. So we're hoping to have a nice balance of just sitting and speaking, as well as giving the opportunity to Zoom, but also those who live stream, to share their questions, and giving Marla and Jonathan a little bit more to think about, perhaps push them further on their suggestions and tips that they'll offer us. And so without further delay, I will start the discussion, pose the first question goes to Mala and Jonathan. So we're hoping, and that's really the broad questions are launched as well as a lot of career scholars, but as well as more established scholars quite often end up asking is what do you think are the major differences in academics, been more to think about, and further on their suggestions do you think there are grey areas to be raised? And so without further delay, I will start the first question goes to Mala and Jonathan. So we're hoping, and that's
very much,
really the broad
Gunjan.
questions
Thanks for having me.
The
question about the difference between academic versus policy-oriented journals, there is no very black and white answer to that. It really depends on the disciplines. No? So like disciplines-based journals, like for example, if you're in sociology, then there are various journals like the American Journal of Sociology, American Sociological Review, Current Sociology, etc. So you know that coming from that background, those are the likely journals that you would like to approach if you would like to publish your work. But then on the policy side, I'm frankly not so familiar with that type of journal. But a good way to start would also be starting from your discipline, no? Whether you are in health, in sociology, geography, so forth and so on. It would be good to take a look at the Web of Science journals that are indexed there, so that you have an idea of the range of journals that are relevant to your field of study and your particular discipline. And then, if you're really very interested in policy-oriented journals, then you identify what those journals are. And I guess a very important thing that you could also keep in mind is to look into the guidelines of the journals. What are the guidelines that they provide to those who wish to submit manuscripts? Because there could be specific requirements that they might have. Like for example, in the case of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, although our focus is on migration, but we also have a very specific geographic focus. So anything about migration-related questions and themes, but it has to be about migration to, in, or from Asia and Pacific. So I guess that would be the two tips that I'd like to share. And there's also quite a bit of an overlap. No? You could publish in a scholarly-oriented or academic-oriented journal, but it doesn't mean to say that you cannot have some policy implications as part of your paper. But again, depending also on the specific requirements of specific journals. So there could actually be a lot of overlaps between the two. And there's also quite a
great. Thanks so much for that, Mala. Jonathan.
Thanks, Gunjan. Thanks for having me on this Zoom. I mean, I agree with Mala. I think, ahead of this meeting, I did kind of go over some of the journals that I think I knew to look at their aims. And I have to say, sometimes it's not that clear what the balance is between, if you like, more theoretical, conceptual, and policy. So it is worth talking to more senior colleagues about journals. But I mean, certainly read the aims of the journal, but then maybe talk to people. But I was reflecting on this question. I think there are kind of three main differences between, if you like, writing for an academic journal, writing for a policy journal. I think one is language. So how you write. I mean, that very kind of convoluted, verbose social science approach that might work in a more theoretical journal, I think will get knocked back if you write like that for a policy journal. So I think you have to adjust how you write. I mean, just language, length of sentences, things like that. Secondly, I think there's a shift in content. This is a sort of statement of the obvious, but less theory, more policy. If you're writing for a policy journal, if you're writing for a more academic journal, probably it needs to be embedded more firmly and more fully in the theoretical frameworks that inform the discipline that you're working in. And probably, sometimes there doesn't have to be any policy at all, but if there is policy, it's sort of kind of second order. And I think thirdly, how you construct an argument is different. So the nature of argumentation. in a more academic, discipline-based journal is different from a policy journal. So I would say those are the three ways in which you need to adjust how you present your case and your evidence. And I mean, that's something you said, Gunjan, which I think is really important, and it's the title of this session, Writing for Different Audiences. You've got to really adjust and write for the journal, and therefore working out what it is the journal does. I mean, like sort of Marla's journal is an Asia-Pacific journal. So you know the geographical kind of field that you're speaking to, and it's on migration. And yeah, so you can begin to say, right, these are the, if you like, the individuals, the people who are going to be reading my paper and probably reading it. And so making sure that you adjust your writing to fit the demands of the journal is really important. And sometimes, last thing to say, it's kind of hard to do because we're trained to write in a particular way. And I mean, for me, I come from an academic background, so I find writing policy stuff really hard. And I'm working with people in policy. They're endlessly criticizing me. You know, Jonathan, you just can't write like this. People won't understand what on earth you're on about. And so, you know, I think you sort of don't imagine that Martha and I have, you know, are able to adjust our writing easily. It does take work. It's hard work to do that. I come from an academic background, so find writing policy stuff.
Thanks so much. Just, I guess, following on from both what you, Marla and Jonathan have said. So the work that's required to move from academic to what might be more solution or recommendation or policy oriented.
You know, are able to adjust our writing easily.
I guess, what are some of the challenges or the things that you've had to do or that come to your mind? That, you know, because as you were saying, Jonathan, you know, when you're writing papers, you're getting feedback immediately saying this will not make sense. Perhaps what is it that people should not do or avoid doing if they're trying to write a more policy-oriented or recommendation-oriented paper as opposed to an academic paper? Or the things that you've had to do or that come to your mind?
Well, actually, in our experience,
because as you were saying, Jonathan, you know, when you're writing papers, you're getting feedback immediately.
Research at the Scalarbini Migration Center. What we do is that we, you know, like for specific research projects, I mean, the end product is a research report. But a research report is not necessarily also something that's publication ready as far as journal requirements are concerned. So actually, even if you've done a decent research project, if you have completed a decent research project, you may have complied with a research report, you end up with a research report, but if you wish to publish to a journal, you still have to translate, you still have to do some changes in how you organize the paper. And organize it in such a way that suits the requirements of specific journals. So actually for academic writing, even if you have a report, you still have to translate that into publication ready or a journal appropriate type of writing and organization so that it would be considered for publication and would have a chance of being published. In trying to address the policy aspects, what we have done in the center is actually long reports. We have produced what are known as policy briefs. So these are shorter versions, these are summaries and highlights of the long research project that hopefully also meet the requirements and the needs of policymakers who always tell us that they don't have a lot of time to go through a 100-page research report or even longer. So that's the strategy that we have adopted. But I would also say that, you know, like really, there's a lot of transformation of materials that's involved, you know, because, you know, I was talking about our experience in producing research reports. But take, for example, also the case of those who have completed their dissertations or theses. They have very good products. They have very good research products, but a dissertation is not ready also for journal publication. So doctoral students, graduates still have to do a lot of work to be able to transform parts or certain sections of their thesis or dissertation into an academic journal. They have very good products. They have very good.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Gunjan, I think the I don't know if it's a trick, but I think the necessity, in a sense, is the same whether you're writing for a policy or for a more academic outlet, which is to make clear why you're, I mean, I imagine many people on this Zoom will be doing kind of case study based empirical work. So how does that material, sort of, why is it important? Why is it significant? And how does it speak either to policy or to conceptual debates in the field, in sociology, in migration studies, in geography, whatever it happens to be? And often I think you have to take, if you like, the reader by the hand and say, come with me. I'm going to show you why my little study in northeast Thailand, which is where I did my PhD, why you need to know about this place. Yeah, why you need to grasp the empirics and make those evident and important, make that the importance evident for a wider readership. People who have probably never been to Mahasarakham in Northeast Thailand and no desire to go there, why they should bother spending half an hour reading my paper. And so, in a sense, whether it's for policy, you're telling policymakers, this is how my research speaks to policy debates about whether we should intervene in this way or that way, you know, why these policies fail, whatever it is. Or, alternatively, why this is important for our understanding of migration and why migration, we shouldn't assume that migration transitions are the same in different parts of the world and so on and so forth. And I think that's often when you're in the middle of your research, you need to spend a year gathering data and you almost, I mean, if you're anything like me, you think, of course this is important. I mean, it's going to be evident. I don't have to tell you, but I think you do. You have to say, this is why you need to read this paper. And of course, if you can get that message across to reviewers and journal editors, yeah, clearly, then you've kind of got them on side from the start. And then it becomes a question of how can we improve it? How can we, you know, refine it? But if you don't make that case, they'll probably say, well, it's an interesting, you know, issue, but I don't see the point. I don't see the relevance. I don't see what, and then it gets rejected before you can get that opportunity, you know, that kind of revise and resubmit or minor corrections or whatever it is. Yeah, clearly, then you've kind of got them on side from the start.
Thank you so much for that.
The question of how can we improve it? How can we, you know, refine it?
Of course,
if you don't make that case,
that the development series is very much around writing for different audiences, and it is just being aware of what are the requirements of those different audiences. And I guess then the question is, how do you go about identifying what those requirements are? We've already outlined some of the policy versus academic requirements, but if you're an early career scholar and you've only ever just read academic papers or policy papers, how do you, you know, and now you're starting to write yourself, how do you just go about determining what are the requirements of the policy journals as opposed to the academic journals or the different kinds of journals that they might be considering publishing in? Mala. But if you're an early career scholar and you've only ever
starts with the research question, what you are looking at,
how do you,
how clearly are the research questions articulated? You know, Jonathan has mentioned several times. Why is it interesting? Why is that worth studying? And you know, part of being able to address that question is, of course, knowing the literature. What is the state of knowledge about the specific questions that are of interest? And also, that's what a lot of reviewers, those who are, you know, submitting manuscripts to us, that's what a lot of reviewers would ask. So where is this research question situated in the, I mean, does it have a dialogue with the existing literature, let's say on migration? Because that's also a way of finding out about, when you have a research question, then you ask, what has been done about this? And how has this particular research question been addressed by other researchers? And the way to find out about that is really to go back to the books. What has been written about in the journals? What has been published about it? And that's how also we see that there's some kind of finding out that's how we see also developments in a specific field. When there's a decent amount and rich body of literature that has been written about certain research questions. The literature review is really very helpful. It's also very helpful not only in knowing what is out there in the field, but also I think in having a sense of humility about what our research project can actually contribute to the existing knowledge. Because sometimes if we don't have an idea of what other people have done, it's like, oh, this is really something very, very special. Maybe this is something very unique. But then when you look at the literature and what has been written about those the questions that are of interest to us, then it can be a humbling experience to also know, oh, actually, this is not so novel after all. But at least it also gives us a sense of how has it been studied? Is my way of, is the methodology that I'm thinking of maybe looking at the question in a different way, and maybe I can have answers that are quite different, may not be, maybe the approach that I'm thinking about is something that other scholars have not really tried, and maybe I'll get different sets of answers and insights from how I will do it. And so the lit review is very important because that also gives us a sense of what can be value adding, how our work can contribute to the existing literature. We also have a sense of what we may be able to contribute to what is already out there. Different sets of answers and insights.
Right, thanks so much, Marla. Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of kind of repeating what Marla's just said, I think, well, often with my students, I mean, if you like, this identification of what's sometimes termed the research gap, and often I think the way that it's sometimes argued is, well, the gap is, no one has done work on agrarian change in this part of Laos or whatever it is. I mean, to my mind, that is quite a low-level gap. It's an empirical gap. No one's done this before. I think what you have to argue, particularly if it's an academic paper in an academic journal, is why filling that gap is important in broader terms. So I'm kind of repeating myself, but I mean, so often when I review a paper, it's said, well, it's a kind of quite a simplistic gap that people are justifying the paper on. I think you then need to take it to a kind of slightly higher level and say, right, and not only am I doing research that no one's done before in kind of empirical terms, but because I'm doing this, I'm addressing this pervasive issue or problem or challenge or question or whatever it is. And then I think you kind of draw the reader in a more profound way. Secondly, I would say don't exaggerate the importance of your work. I think that often puts reviewers' backs up. No one has done this before. It's never been addressed. I mean, I'm kind of repeating what Marla's saying, but yeah. So I think actually being modest in your claims is no bad thing sometimes. So because I mean, as they say, there's very little new under the sun. Almost everything has been done. So I think we're talking about kind of incremental, small steps forward. So I don't think you have to overdo it. And I think if you do overdo it, and you have a reader who knows the literature, they will say that's simply not the case. Yeah, people have done this before, and you're not doing something that's novel, and that immediately puts a reviewer in a kind of bad state of mind. Certainly know the literature. Don't say, as mentioned, that there's been very little on this, because you probably get a reviewer who will say, well, there has, and here are 20 papers that I can just mention off the top of my head. So knowing the literature's really important. I have done this before, and not doing something that's novel. And this is all about, I mean, I think both what Marla and I are talking about is how you make a case for your paper. There's a really nice paper by Christian Lund, I don't know if you've seen it, it's published in 2014, which is about, I think the title is something like sort of what is this a case of? And it's all about this, how do we deploy case studies in ways that draw in, readers who.
Kasi speaker na gano'n. Kaya maruwa ka ganun yun.
That whole setting up process for the reader, and as I say, when you take the reader and you lead them towards your empirical, you make your case for your case, and then I think you're kind of 80% of the way there. But having said that, I mean, this is at the front of my mind at the moment. I've just had a paper co-authored paper published in World Development. It took us 18 months from the first submission to publication. And this is a journal that prides itself on turning things around quickly. And boy did we struggle in bringing the third reviewer on board. So one reviewer was very enthusiastic, one reviewer didn't get it. And boy did we have to work hard. So, just because kind of Marla and I have been in this game for a while, don't imagine that it's not a struggle for us as well. We have paper, I don't know, can't speak for Marla, but, I have papers rejected all the time. So I've got no sort of magic sort of wand that means, yes, if you do all these things, you'll get a paper accepted. Because fortunately, we're all different. We're all look for different things. So reviewers very rarely agree across the board. It's very often you'll have, particularly if your paper is ambitious, if you're trying to say something new and different and provocative, you will get people who like that and you will get people who won't. So in a sense, the more ambitious that your paper, probably the higher the chances that a reviewer somewhere will take exception to it.
I would just like to add a little bit to what Jonathan has said, because, like, for example, I do notice, that even the manuscripts that we receive, if a contributor would say things like, no one has ever done this before, actually you pay more attention to it than really. Has no one really ever done this before? And, I think reviewers are also alerted to, focusing more on the lit review. So that the claim about this being a pioneering research is indeed guaranteed. But I'd also just like to mention that while for many topics, for many research questions, we do rely on what has been done, the lit review, and all that. I think what we also need to recognize, and maybe this comes up more for policy-oriented types of research, is when an emergency situation or a very different situation comes about. And again, just to cite a very specific example, like in March 2020, we were preparing many things in relation to a policy review of one of the policies, labor migration policies in the Philippines, the one on the ban on the direct hiring of Filipino workers by foreign-based employers and companies. But then COVID-19 came in March 2020, that had to take a back seat. And as researchers, you also have to grapple with the question, what do we do? Okay, like in the case of the Philippines, so many returnees who came back to the Philippines because of COVID-19. So the research question, it's like the situation itself raises many research questions, and many of them are policy oriented. What do we do with this large numbers of returnees and repatriates to the Philippines, what would be their employment prospects, you know, in a situation where the domestic economy is also doing very badly, you know, so forth and so on. So the situation itself, you know, could also present many challenges that would require research, consultations, and so forth, so that we could also help clarify what the challenges are and what are some of the emerging solutions that could be thought out.
Thank you for that, Marla and Jonathan. I think as you were speaking, it occurred to me that so much of when we are sort of get our initial training and as we progress through our various career stages, publishing is framed around producing new research and new things, all the things that we do. But I think as you were speaking, it occurred to me how important, and perhaps we need to emphasize this further, is the role of the literature review section and making that case. And that unless you're able to make that really strong case, your presentation of the data that you've collected and the analysis that you're going to do, which is, yes, what you're doing as a researcher, loses some of the value that it can offer if you don't really make that really strong case. And a lot of that is in the literature review. So whether you're making that case for policy or whether you're making the case for the academic conceptual bit, it's that first part of the paper, and in effect, the you know, when you contextualize but also make that case, that's just as valuable and important as the original data that you're going to present. And I think sometimes we tend to forget that because so much of the emphasis is the data that we've collected, and that's really exciting, and we want to present that. But in fact, regardless of the policy or the academic or whatever audience that you're writing to, making that case, particularly in journal publications, is crucial. And it's good to be, you know, yeah, it seems very obvious when you said it, but at the same time, I said, well, I spend way too much time on the analysis and not enough time writing up a lot of the literature review, you know, discussions and making that case. And perhaps that's also a shift in something that we need to consider as we're trying to write our journal publications. I'm conscious of time, and I realize we have another 15 minutes or so left before we sort of start the Q&A session. I mean, there's a whole host of questions that I know that we said, you know, for us to discuss on. I think at this point, perhaps I'll ask more specific questions first to Marla and then to Jonathan, and then maybe bring the conversation in together. Marla, you've already said some of these points already, and in particular, as a journal editor, you know, you bring to the discussion a very particular view and very particular sets of knowledges that everyone would, you know, that everyone gains from. So what do you think are some of the major considerations to keep your journal relevant to both academic and non-academic audiences? So as early scholars are writing, whether they're writing for academic journals or whether they're writing for that theoretical piece, or whether they're writing a policy-oriented piece and they're submitting it to the journal, how do you sort of, you know, make sure that the pieces coming into you, to the journal, are relevant to both academic and non-academic audiences? And in particular, because you're working with stakeholders, you know, yeah. So some considerations there that people can think about as they're writing their papers.
I guess like any other academic journal, APMJ really relies on the contributions of referees, because referees are the ones that really contribute significantly in ensuring that the articles that are published in the journal are indeed publishable and are up to the standards of academic journals. So we really rely a lot on the very valuable contributions of the referees who devote time and energy in reviewing the manuscripts that we receive in APMJ. So that's one. But also what we have done also in the journal is have some space for other types of contributions. So of course, the journal is mostly made up of regular contributions that go through the review process. And then from time to time, we do have what are known as thematic issues. So it could be special issues on specific regions or specific types of migration or specific questions. No, so that's also, I also find that very, very valuable, because then it draws attention to specific themes. No, it speaks to specific themes, and the articles come in one volume. Okay? But what we have also done in APMJ is to have some space. Sometimes it's a research note, so these are ongoing research. Sometimes it's a commentary. Sometimes it's a conference report. I think these are some of the contributions that are, I think, appreciated by policymakers, because they're also shorter. The language is a bit different, no, compared to the regular articles. No? Yeah, indeed, I think these are also important types of knowledge and information that need to be disseminated. So, and I think also the turnaround time is quicker, like for conference reports, if it's something that was done just last month and it times in with the the schedule of a specific issue, then it also has currency, you know? Because normally journal articles also take time. The review process could be lengthy as well. So it could run from, I guess, the minimum from, if it's really something that we are able to invite reviewers quickly, and reviewers also commit to sending their reviews within a given period, at least 6 months for a contribution to be published, and that's under very optimistic conditions. And so the space for commentaries, for research notes, these are think pieces as well as documentation. So like, for instance, again, just to give you an example, you know, since there's a lot of interest in labor migration policies and laws in the Philippines, like in the recent issue of APMJ, we included as documentation the new law that creates the Department of Migrant Workers. So it's not a regular article, but it's useful as documentation. So those are some of the strategies. The perennial one is, the traditional way, of really relying on the contributions of referees, so that the articles that get published are the ones that are publishable indeed.
Just, I guess, a follow-up, then all the reviewers that for APMJ, both academics and non-academics, so would they include stakeholders or, for various organizations?
For the papers?
Yeah.
The papers are reviewed by academics.
Okay. And but also, because migration is a very particular field in that, you can have conceptual papers, but at the same time, you have very, solutions and oriented, policy oriented and recommendation oriented papers as well. Is there then the understanding that the migration, the reviewers in particular, the academic reviewers are also able to speak to and being able to read and review those the slightly less theoretical pieces and more, policy oriented pieces? Yeah,
we do look into also the field, as well as the interest and expertise of reviewers. So indeed, there are many policy questions around migration issues in the region. So there are academics that are really purely academics, but then also there are academics that have some engagements, like, let's say, with civil society organizations, etc. Or those there are academics that actually also specialize on policy questions on migration. So it's a matter of finding a fit between the contribution, what kind of paper it is it, and then also finding the appropriate reviewer for that one.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Marla. Again, a more specific but sort of related question for you, Jonathan. Within your field, within agrarian studies broadly, but also more specifically within the region that you work with, how do you then manage the various, as we say, the various audiences, but the geographical audiences as well? How do you manage trying to write not just the policy or the academic with your collaborators' papers, but to write to the audience, let's say a predominantly English-speaking audience, or as you say, a broader audience that might not be interested in this specific region, but might be interested in the wider issues that you are engaging with. So do you, what are some of the other considerations around writing for the different audiences, but specifically as you're negotiating issues around the policy or the academic, but also the wider geographical focuses and everything that comes with that, right? How do you make sure people read your work?
Yeah, well, I'm sometimes surprised when I think that a paper's kind of sunk without trace. You write a paper, you get it published, and that's it. And you think, wow, it's like kind of throwing a pebble into a pond. There's an initial ripple, but that's it. It's sunk and it's gone. And then I go to a conference and someone says, "Oh, Jonathan, I enjoyed your paper." I think, wow, someone's read it, which is, occasionally a surprise. I think we, and of course, that's one of the thrills of being a scholar, is that people actually engage with your work and they read it and you think they found something of value in it. And at moments like that, you think it was worth it. But a lot of the time, of course, we're publishing, papers coming out, this sort of thing, and who knows what happens. So to answer your question, over my kind of career, it's sort of dragged on for many years now. I started at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is very much a regional studies centre. I then moved to Durham University, to a mainstream geography department, which had no Asian real interest. So when I was at SOAS, people were interested in my work because they were interested in the places where I studied. When I moved to Durham, I had to, sort of colleagues on I had to make my case in a completely different way as to why I thought, my work in rural areas of Southeast Asia was relevant for people working, maybe not anywhere in the global South, maybe they're just working in the UK. And it comes back to what Marla and I have been talking about so far. How you do that is by engaging with the literature. And I see there's a question in the chat about how do you access that literature if you're in a regional university, maybe which doesn't have great access to e-journals and so on, and maybe we'll come back to that. And that's when you have to kind of work hard at it. And I think you have to take a step back from the minutiae of your work, the specifics of it, and show why, those two tendencies of kind of specifying and generalizing. How do you generalize? How do you make the case of something being an exemplar for a bigger set of debates and issues? And of course, one of the ways you do that is read the literature. So don't always, I work on Southeast Asia, and I've found some of the best work I've read is actually on, James Ferguson's work on Africa, just fantastic. I learn an awful lot from reading work on places that are not Southeast Asian. So sometimes you have to kind of get out of your comfort zone and you have to read things on other places, maybe in other disciplines. I'm a geographer, but I read a lot of anthropology, a lot of sociology, a lot of development studies, and I find that actually is really useful enterprise for me in thinking about my work in geography. And that is, I was going to say hard to do. I'm not sure it's hard to do, but there is a tendency to always revert to the things we're familiar with, the countries we know, the places we know, the journals we know, the disciplines we know. And I think moving beyond that is really an important thing to do, particularly if you're trying to publish in one of those high impact journals that define a discipline. In geography, it's probably Transactions of the IBG, Annals of the Association of American Geographers, Progress in Human Geography. Those are the three. And they are, they take research from anywhere and everywhere. So for that, making the case is so much more important than if I publish, say, in Asia Pacific Viewpoint, which I mentioned already, where it's a kind of different process. So it comes back to this writing for different audiences, writing for the specifics of the journal. And I mean, if you think of the, I mean, I don't want to set the bar too high, but think of the sort of scholars of Southeast Asia whose work has transcended the region. People like Jim Scott, people like maybe like Tanya Lee, that sort of thing. Yeah, what have they done? So think of James Scott's book, Weapons of the Weak. It's based on a village study of Sedeka in Kedah in Malaysia, and probably anyone who works on agrarian change would have read it. Yeah, how did he manage to do that? Now, of course, I mean, I can't do that. I mean, only Jim Scott can do that. But I mean, in a sense, that's the kind of thing we're doing, making that translation. And so whether it, as I say, I imagine many people on this call work in and on Asia, but don't feel that you're then restricted to publishing in journals that have a kind of Asian remit. Ask that question, right? I'm going to go for, a generalist journal. I'm going to show why my research is important. I'm going to make that case. And we've returned to that point several times in this conversation already. Reading the literature. Well, maybe last thing to say before I stop whittering on is I think sharing your research, trying it out, particularly in sort of post-COVID. I mean, there's so many more conferences are like this, and actually you can sign up, you could talk, don't hide your research and then just send it into a journal. Test it, test drive it, time and again, give a seminar in your department, go online and do a paper at a conference, send it to someone who might have been your PhD examiner or whatever, saying, can you tell me, what do you think of this? I'm thinking of submitting it to this journal. Can you give me feedback? And then, because of course, the thing about journal, I'm sorry, you probably all know this, but with a journal, you can only submit to one journal at a time. I mean, this world development paper I've just been talking about took 18 months. So for those 18 months, we thought we had a really good paper, but we couldn't send it anywhere else. So you don't want endlessly to be, having to submit and resubmit and that sort of thing. And one of the way of getting it as close to final product as possible is by sharing it, trying it out, test driving it. And then I think you probably will iron out those problems, which often takes so long to come through in the reviewing process, which can be enormously drawn out. And it's so, if you're an early career researcher, you've got to get stuff on your CV as quickly as possible. Yeah. But you also don't want to kind of go for the low-hanging fruit, the easier journals. You want to get your research, if it's important, in the best journal that you can. So the question is, how do I make sure that my paper is sufficiently kind of foolproof, if you like, to get through that? And one way of achieving that is, I think, by sharing and talking and so on, and getting feedback and asking people to feed in and comment.
Yeah, I agree. What Jonathan has mentioned about the thrill of conferences is indeed something I think that many of us really relate to. And I have also approached many people and telling them how much I admire their work. And it's also, actually, you also get a lot of feedback from conference participants. So in a way, the feedback could be very useful also in developing and strengthening the work that you've already done, the work that you've started in writing the paper. So conferences are ways of exchanging and meeting other scholars as well. And I think that's a very important part in growing in growing and maturing as an academic. I'd also just like to mention one thing. I hope because I'm not sure, Jonathan, if this is true in the case of the UK, but in the case of countries like the Philippines, there are also examples of what we know as predatory journals. So I hope that our participants here would be duly cautious about these predatory journals. Usually you would know them because they would charge something for the submission. Although I do know that some of the very reputable journals also charge fee for the review process, because I understand they get a lot of contributions, and that's one way, I think, for them to filter the very serious ones and the ones who are, I think, fairly confident that they've done a pretty good work, so that they can, shore up some money for the review process. But that is upfront, no? And that is for journals that have a very long history. But unfortunately, there are predatory journals. Maybe they differ in names from country to country, but also just to be cautious about these types of journals. So usually they would also have a tie-up with like some conference, and sometimes the conference can even be held outside of one's country. And you would have a sense that something is not quite right, because then, like the prizes are like best PowerPoint presentation, best in national costume, and things like that. So just be very cautious. And I think this is also, like what Jonathan has mentioned earlier, maybe speak with other scholars, with other colleagues, just to make sure that, you are indeed submitting to a legit journal.
Thank you for that, Marla. I think just highlighting some of the issues within the publication industry, particularly for academic publication, is important. Increasingly now with the predatory journals, and then being able to differentiate between sort of more reputable open access journals as opposed to predatory journals as well. And then obviously the non-open access. But I think it's also, I realize we need to move to the discussion section of it, but I do wonder if you could just briefly speak to some of the issues around within academic publishing, and who actually has access and the ability, or who's allowed to speak and given access to speak within journals, right? So notoriously, the fact that a lot of publications, a lot of research that's done within Asia and Southeast Asia or in Africa are in fact published by white scholars, and that their work is received, and they're allowed to speak to Asian concerns and issues, and they're allowed to speak to African concerns and issues. However, African scholars and Asian scholars are not allowed to, are not given space, or very are put into place around it, even if there are policy recommendations, and how those are received. So the structural issues that exist that prevent scholars, particularly early career scholars, to be able to be part of those conversations. I think obviously it's become more and more obvious, and it's being spoken more openly now. So how do what are some of your thoughts around that, and how can scholars not be disheartened, especially early career scholars, not be disheartened when all of a sudden what they think is good work and more generally being received well, but then got through the publication process and they're not allowed to publish, or various other barriers are put into place because of where they're located. So some thoughts on that, and then we'll transition into some of the other questions as well.
Yeah, shall I go first?
Yeah, Jonathan.
I think, you're right, Gunjan. I mean, most journals are based in the global north, and of course, most of them are Anglophone journals, so people are writing in a second language, and some journals are better than others at recognizing that maybe people's English is not perfect, and actually that shouldn't be, and looking beyond that for the quality of the argument and the evidence that is being presented. Some journals just reject papers if they're not written perfectly. And I mean, how can you do that if you're, based in the university in Laos or whatever? So I think, the inequalities are enormous. And if anything, I think they're getting worse, partly because of the way in which universities in Asia and elsewhere are also playing the impact factor, the citation game. And if you look at the journals with the highest impact factors, where does it take you? It takes you to the usual suspects. So I mean, how do we break this down? I mean, I don't know. I mean, Marla, as an editor, will probably have some things to say. But I mean, at the moment I'm reading a paper by someone called J.C. Gaillard on earthquakes and disasters, and he examined the percentage of authors from the countries where the disasters occurred. who wrote papers. And I mean, I've got the figures here for Haiti, the Haiti 2010 earthquake, 3% of papers on Haiti are by Haitian authors. For Nepal 2015, it's 11%. For the Philippines, Typhoon Yolanda 2013, it's 12%. So in other words, 90% plus of the papers on these events are written by people who aren't based in the countries and are not probably published in journals. They're published in journals that are based here in the UK. For Hurricane Katrina, 91% of papers are written by US-based authors. So, I mean, you can see that kind of gives an insight into the inequalities that go from who writes, who speaks, where we speak, what language we write in, and also the very way in which arguments are made. I mean, papers take a particular format. We've been talking about, the literature review, the methods, that sort of thing. That's a very specific approach to making, for arguing, constructing an argument. And it comes from a kind of Anglophone, Anglo-centric, Eurocentric tradition. I mean, we could do it differently, but of course people don't, because as I say, everyone is now playing the same game. And the globalization of higher education means that, in a sense, these norms are permeating globally and everyone is playing the same game now. So if anything, it's getting worse rather than better. So I'm sorry not to be more enthusiastic about the direction of travel, but I mean, I think, I go and, in fact, next week I'm going to Konkan and Bangkok, and Konkan University I work with, and boy, they require their PhD students to publish in ISI Scopus journals before they get their PhD. I mean, we don't even do that here in Bristol, and so if anything, it's becoming more of an issue rather than less of one over time, and that's deeply disappointing.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Wala.
It's a very tough situation, and actually we recognize, for example, that when we have a state of the art of migration research in the region, in Asia, we recognize. I mean, this is a paper that actually co-wrote with Parvati and Nicola. We recognize that what we are also able to have access to are those materials, articles that are written in English. So we are not able to cover the many works that have been done by colleagues based in Korea, in China, and Japan, in Thailand, if they are written in their own languages. So the bias for English comes up, but we valorize things that are written in English, and we very much de-emphasize the works that are written in the different in non-English languages, and I see that also as very, very sad. So actually, even in terms, I have to be very candid. Like for example, the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal, it's not necessarily a high impact journal compared to the other journals. But it has longevity, I suppose, because it has been there since 1992. And also working in the background, it's really very tough. For us, the review process and the editing process takes a very long time because of the language. But we have to we have to acknowledge that we work with non-English speakers and writers in the region. So if the purpose of the journal is to be able to give voice to the work that is done by researchers in the region. So we have to invest a lot more time with, a lot of the background work. So that's really part of that's really part of the struggle. And so my personal reflections actually about the situation is, yes, the impact factor is very important. But what does it is important, I think, to advance, in the academic world, because that's where promotions are based. That's where tenure is based. So like what Jonathan has mentioned, now even PhD students have to publish in a high impact journal so that they make it to graduation. So sometimes I feel that the emphasis on that type of publication is so overrated. Because I do wonder about the relevance. What's the relevance of the research? and in a way, maybe it's part also of the policy question. No? So how has it, because especially in a region such as Asia, we deal with so many challenges. No? So how has the research also contributed to making people's lives better? That's also something that's very important. So I think it depends also on the scholars, no? what they will emphasize, the relevance of their work, the contributions maybe to improving policies and programs in the countries and communities where they are, although that has a certain cost, because maybe that means that they won't have as much time in devoting to publishing in a high impact journal. So it's really, in a sense, it boils down also to the choices that people can make, the many constraints that they have to face. And sometimes I think also some inequities and maybe some disparities, or how we also structure the incentive system, no? in academic institutions. No? So like, for example, in the Philippines, I know that some universities, when their faculty publish in high impact factor, they get a certain amount, no? to incentivize the process. No? But when you publish in a local journal, you also get some financial award, but it's much smaller compared to when you publish in a high impact journal. So in a sense, I like the idea also incentivizing, so people can, will be encouraged to devote more time, because writing is really very difficult. It's not easy, no? And especially in academic writing, you have to document. Even if you just got one statement from direct quotation from one book, you have to document the page number because it's a direct quotation. So it's a lot also of very much attention to details. It's labor-intensive work. So while the idea of incentives is good, but then maybe it also creates certain distortions and maybe unnecessary hierarchies, within academic institutions. So I'm not sure if that's the way to, encourage more publications, or maybe it could even lead to more inequalities in academic institutions as well. So yeah, not a very straightforward answer, but what I've shared are some of the, I think, difficulties, in the real.
No, and thank you so much for that, and I appreciate that. It is it's nothing new, but it's also ongoing, and it'll continue to stay with us. And as Jonathan said, it's probably getting worse in lots of ways. And as you said, Marla, it's especially if you incentivize certain things over certain journals over others, it creates a whole nother hierarchy. Another set of issues that people have to navigate, especially early career scholars. But I just want to say a massive thanks for the discussion so far, but it's not quite over, as we've got a whole set of other questions that are lining up. So if I could ask everyone to either just raise their hand using Zoom functionality, or you could put the question in the chat box, and we'll keep an eye on the order of it and try to get as many as we can. I'm just scrolling up to the top now with a question by Noor Jana. Noor, would you like to unmute yourself if you're still there? I hope you're still there. If you'd like to unmute yourself and maybe just say the question out. Noor?
Yes, hello, good afternoon.
Good. Hi, go ahead, Noor.
Hello, I am Norjan Gulembayan from the Provincial Government of Davao Oriental. I am working in the provincial government. I just want to raise these two questions I have here. First, just to echo or to remember that there is really a lack of attention on the importance of literature review around in this part of our country. May I ask for practical advice or advices on how to really start doing it, especially with the scarce resources and the lack of access to quality journals in the country? And my second question is, how do you write or communicate your scholarly paper intended for government officials or employees who are generally less interested to read? So Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. Marla, would you like to start?
Yes, the cost of subscribing to journals or even buying an article is very prohibitive. It's very prohibitive for those of us coming from this part of the world. So I don't know, maybe it would be possible for them to have maybe some tie-ups with libraries that have centralized subscriptions to some of these journals, because what I know, I mean, the subscription and the publishing world also have changed so much, because of the internet. But I know that many publishing companies, they have they offer bundles of the different journals that they produce, and usually they have institutional rates that are lower, and these are for libraries that subscribe to them. So I don't know if maybe it would be possible for them to have links with the universities near them. Maybe Ateneo de Davao would be one example. Maybe they have subscriptions to many of these journals, and hopefully maybe some arrangement can be made so that people can have access to different journal articles, because otherwise, as individuals, it's very, very expensive. To buy even just one article, it's too much. The other question that she has, how to communicate. Okay. As I mentioned, we one way would be the development of shorter policy briefs and policy papers. So it can be anything from just 3 pages to maybe 5 pages max, so that the highlights are there. The other way would actually be through research dissemination forums, where there is an exchange between researchers and then policymakers, as well as advocates, so that the discussion can be freer, and also the exchange of different insights and opinions can be much more intermediate. And maybe to have that kind of event documented, so that the highlights of what has been discussed, what are the debates, and what are the persisting questions can be made.
Great. Thank you so much, Marla. Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, both really good questions. I mean, I think it's dare I say it, I think it's getting slightly better than it was in terms of the number of papers that are now open access rather than behind paywalls. Means that, of course, kind of wherever you are, if you've got reasonable internet connections, you can get these papers. And I think increasingly in, well, scholars based in the global north, as part of their funding, have to make their papers open access. So I think probably, as I say, I mean, having said in my answer to the last question, things are getting worse. I think in this respect, maybe it's getting slightly better. I think some journals publish review papers, which are very good places to start. So, the state of the art in a particular subfield. So in geography, Progress in Human Geography publishes, short pieces which try to say, this is what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years in this particular area. So finding the journals that do that in your discipline is really good as a starting point, and that then directs you to other papers and so forth. I suppose the third thing to say is, I mean, I think as early career scholars, it's really important for you to be lead authors on papers. But one possibility is to actually co-author. So someone who maybe does have, is based in a university in the north, who can then, if you like, provide that broader context for your particular study and, if you like, access these papers. So don't become, remain the lead author is really important for your career, but that would be an option. I think the final thing to say on this question is, often if you're going to, I think Gunjan talked about Geoforum as a paper. If you're going to publish in Geoforum, before you submit your paper, look at the papers in Geoforum. Make sure that if there is a paper, that you cite those, that you read them if you can get access to them. because often journal editors like to think that their journal is being used as a way of making, if you like, grounding your paper. So do that as well. But I mean, I do accept, when I work with scholars in universities in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Laos, Vietnam, the resources that are available and the teaching loads, of course, and all the rest of it are completely different to the circumstances that I work in. So I'm really conscious of the challenges that I imagine many of those of you on this Zoom call face. The second question about how do you communicate to government officials? This is not peculiar to Asia. It's the same here in the UK. If you want a government official, someone in departments and ministries or politicians to read your stuff, you've got to make it short and sharp, and you've got to make sure that they can read it and understand it. So you've got to kind of weed out all the kind of long words, the terminology which they won't be familiar with. And dare I say, this also applies the same lesson if you were trying to write to an interdisciplinary audience. A couple of years ago, I wrote something in Nature Climate Change. And boy, all that kind of social science kind of terminology that we think everyone, surely they understand these terms. No, and the editor there, this is one of the journals which does have enormous numbers of submissions and a lot of money behind it. And the editing is remarkably, sub-editing, it's kind of remarkably precise. What do you mean by this word? Why do you use this word and you can't use something simpler? And I think so the lesson about how do you communicate with policy, people in kind of policy, government, politicians, so forth, same applies, I think, if you're writing for an interdisciplinary journal. Make sure you don't construct a kind of overly convoluted, opaque arguments simply because that's the tendency in your subject area. And short. Short. Yeah. If it can be said in 5 words rather than 20, say it in 5 words.
No, thank you for that. And if I may just add something to the whole discussion of how do you start your literature reviews. I realize we are here talking about academic publications, but I've also spent the last 2 years now, we've been trying to develop a course on research and how to introduce, getting undergraduates to do research in geography. And I think it's important to also recognize the increasing importance of blogs, but very particular blogs, right? So not just sort of any sort of blogs, but the Conversation, for example, which presents research findings and academic research. So you do get access to certain references and certain starting points on how to think about, in more accessible way, and these are free to get, society and space. Again, these are very geography and or migration specific type references because those are the fields that I've been looking at, but they are increasingly blog sites or blog pieces that are published by academic journals as well, when they'll have as a way of making the research more accessible. So those are also good starting points. And some of the blogs are really insightful and very, and thought-provoking. Academics like Sarah Ahmed, who start their thoughts and ideas and books, ideas on their blog sites as well. So the academics themselves might have blogs as well, where they publish some of their material and make it accessible. So I think there is something to be said about sort of the non-traditional academic routes into academic publications, but getting into those and accessing them through blog sites. But again, you have to be cautious about them. Like Mala said, they're predatory journals. They're also, they're various different kinds of publications. So the quality and how long they've been running, all of those things need to be considered. But I find that sometimes academics or early career scholars are discouraged from using some of these new emerging ways of communicating research. And I would encourage that that's really helpful. I certainly use them quite a bit in my thinking, and that's how you sometimes get the most immediate research that's coming out and most immediate findings, because they haven't yet had to spend 2 years trying to publish one piece. So if it's there in a conference, they might give the presentation at a conference, and that version of that conference paper might be available on the blog. So that might be another way of navigating some of these inequalities and around, and then eventually, contacting the authors as well is always a good way of accessing some of those papers. I know it might seem a bit daunting for those who've never done it, but just email them and say, could I please have a copy of a paper? And some of them would be happy to, and others may not. but there's no harm in asking as well. So, you know, some of the ways of navigating some of these barriers that you may be encountering. Thank you so much for that. We've got another host of questions. I'm just going through the list. I believe it's Carl Joseph Castaneda. If you would like to unmute and perhaps ask your question.
Yes, po.
We've still got Carl.
Okay. Good afternoon, Professor Jonathan, Dr. Maruja, and Dr. Gunjan. So, I am Carl Joseph Castaneda from the Research Division of Davao State College. And my question is, some of us think that the contribution of our study are actually our policy recommendations. So can you share to us what is really a contribution in academic research? Thank you.
So I think the question is, what is considered as, if what you are familiar with as contributions are seen as academic and policy recommendations, what would be considered the contributions of the academic research? Jonathan.
Marla, do you want to go? Or
Go ahead, go ahead.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think, well, it reminds me actually of a conversation I had recently about the Canadian kind of PhD system. And I don't know if this has happened, but there was a working group looking at whether there needed to be a third type of PhD, if you like, which was a more practice-orientated PhD. So, so the, you know, there are, you know, if like the academic PhD and the policy practice PhD. And I think that came out of that. I don't know whether that working group actually decided that they should create a new type of PhD, which is policy and practice. But I mean, I think what sits behind it is what sits behind this question. And if your PhD is driven by a set of kind of policy and practical questions, how do you then reshape that material for an academic audience and maybe for publication in a scholarly journal? I think, in a sense, it's kind of working the other way. I think for most of us, we write academic PhDs, and then the question is, right, how can I have social impact? How can I translate all of this highfalutin stuff into something which is relevant for people on the ground in, you know, policy and practice and so on. And in a sense, this is just sort of turning that challenge the other way around and saying, well, I've got something here which is really important for policy and practice. How can I make it speak to an academic audience? And I think, you know, most research that is policy and practice linked will have an academic, you know, something that you can tease out of it, which will speak to academic debates of one sort or another. And there are also, of course, journals. I mean, in development studies, journals like Development in Practice is, you know, if you like, an academic journal which specifically tries to bring these things together. So this comes back to, I think, where we started the discussion today from, which is not just write for your different audiences, but choose your journal with reference to what it is you want to say and how you want to say it. You know, don't put a highly empirical policy focused piece of work in a mainstream kind of largely theoretical journal. You know, aim for those journals which actually, and that's when you kind of read the aims, you talk to colleagues, maybe PhD supervisors, examiners, saying, oh, do you think this paper which addresses this policy issue will be relevant for this journal? And they'll probably say, well, not sure. What about try this one? And certainly there are journals, and there are, I mean, this comes back to Marla's point, there are often sections of journals which are specifically for policy debates. So you'll have a kind of, like the academic section, and then you'll have a commentary section or a policy section. So if you do your homework, so not just think carefully about what you want to say and how you want to say it, but also do your homework in terms of identifying a journal which fits with what you want to say and how you want to say it. So there's a kind of two-way process there, writing to the audience, but also choosing the right audience. You know, don't turn up and, you know, you're playing your country folk music to people who want to hear techno, you know, or whatever it is. You've got to make sure that you're choosing the right outlet. And I think there are enough of them there now to be able to find outlets for material which perhaps is primarily policy oriented. And again, last thing to say, maybe the challenge there is how does this specific policy intervention or debate in a particular place, how can you scale that up to say, this, concerns, adaptation to climate change globally because blah, blah. So it's the same sort of process about how do you make what seems quite specific general, and that applies both academically but also in policy terms.
Well, yeah, I guess basically maybe what I'd like to add, I think the main point of Jonathan is know the journal. What is its focus? That's certainly very, very useful. But I guess perhaps what can also be started in your own institutions would be maybe a working paper series, so that there's actually actual practice in writing, whether for academic journals or for policy-oriented journals. So maybe develop that kind of culture where research outputs are documented, are written about, and produced as a report. And so the working paper series can also be a way of exchanging ideas with colleagues, not just in your own institution, but in other institutions as well. I think that's just one addition that I'd like to make. Develop that kind of culture of writing, and also to also develop further capabilities in writing in a specific way, not just in a blog way or in a conversational type of way, but writing academically and writing for policy purposes. So that would be my suggestion.
Thanks so much for that, Mala, and thank you, Jonathan, for your response too. We have, well, I don't see any hands up, but we have one more question in the chat, and that's come from Rose Perkins, and that's from Facebook, where we're live streaming the event. The question is, any thoughts on academic papers that are written by undergraduates who are the first author and their supervisor becomes a co-author? So it's not master's or PhD level research, but an undergraduate whose work might be published with the supervisor as the co-author. Do you have any experience of that, or have you heard of that? And any thoughts, pros and cons on publishing with an undergraduate student as the first author with a supervisor? Mala.
Actually, in our experience in APMJ, I think we haven't received any contribution from an undergraduate and a supervisor. At least, I think maybe a level of MA. So I'm not sure. I think it's a good way to start one's academic career, but I've also heard some concerns about it. But I think that's part of mentorship, in a good mentorship relationship that could certainly go a long way in shaping also the student and to develop his or her academic interests along the way. But normally for APMJ, I'm not sure we have gotten such types of contributions, at least MA and supervisor. Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty rare for that. I mean, having said that, one of my kind of dissertation students, undergraduate dissertation students this year, has done a dissertation on veganism, mainstream veganism, and she did an online survey and got 4,500 responses from vegans all over the world. And you think, wow, that is an amazing data set. And so, you might think, and if you're like an academic, could say, well, let's work on this data set and come up with something. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think Mala's absolutely right. It's unusual, and probably an exceptional undergraduate might be able to do that. I mean, of course, this sort of co-authorship. I mean, I work with physical geographers, and in the natural sciences, it's normal if say a PhD student publishes a paper for the supervisor to be an author, automatically an author on a paper. So some of the PhDs that I've supervised, I mean, there are papers, you know, if you kind of look on Google Scholar that I don't even know I've written. I come across them, I think, boy, why am I on that? And it's because of that tendency in the natural sciences to add your supervisor. In the social sciences and the humanities, generally don't. You know, if you're a PhD student, you write your stuff and you're the sole author. So there are different cultures of publications across the natural and social sciences. And I mean, I think, well, my sort of piece of advice is also be careful not to kind of go too early. I think we're all, there's increasingly this, I mean, you know, it took me years to publish my first paper. There was no pressure on whereas now the pressure to publish is huge. And I think sometimes I read things my early career researchers send me, and I think, wow, this person really needs to leave this for a year and actually think about it and read more and do more research. It's too early. And I think we've created the context kind of across the world where everyone thinks they have to start publishing, you know, from kind of cradle to grave, you know, and I think actually slow scholarship, you know, I mean, dare I say, letting things sit and mature and think about them and do more reading and consider things and put stuff to one side and come back to it. You know, it's really good advice. But I know this sort of, we have to just keep publishing. And, you know, this requirement for many universities in Asia where, you know, before you get your PhD, you have to have, you know, something published. I think that's just making, if you like, this situation worse. So I'm probably a lone voice, and that's, again, the direction of travel. But I do read things and come away thinking, you know, and maybe this question from Rose about undergraduate students, you know, maybe you think, right, well, do a master's on that area, you know, take your undergraduate ideas, do a master's, and maybe then publish. It is very early, but I'm not saying, you know, never. I'm sure there will be one or two things, and maybe this kind of vegan survey where maybe it will happen, but certainly not the norm. Far from it.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jonathan, and thank you, Marla. We've got one more question, and this is actually a sort of a broader question from the DNSE faculty themselves, who've been kind enough to organise this. And really speaks to the core of what's prompted the series of seminars, and this particular one where, you know, just trying to understand how do you write for different audiences. So the question, and Elson, would you like to read that out on behalf of the faculty rather than me?
All right, I hope you can hear me. Okay, so this is a common experience to many of our faculty members. So the question is, we have projects in some small and specific communities here in Davao region as part of the extension projects, which we are required to, especially for state universities and colleges. So how can we communicate this to a larger audience who do not know the area and the projects themselves? So do you have any practical advice on how to engage these in broader audience? Thank you.
Thank you, Elson. Yes, so I think this is a question might be also a good way of wrapping up the talk. So Marla, would you like to?
Okay, I'll try. Well, the one thing that came to my mind is actually to present in conferences. There are many professional conferences in the Philippines. So there's, like, for example, a population association, political science, sociology. One way to approach it would be maybe for your group to organize a panel, make a panel proposal so that you can have like a thematic approach to the session that you will propose to particular conferences. So that would be a good way to share the work that you have done. And also, I think we have to also take advantage of what we have now through Zoom conferences. So you can actually also organize your own conference and you know, showcase the work that you have done. I think this would actually be interesting because like even from in migration, and specifically in the Philippines, it would be interesting to know what happens at the very local level, no? Because what we have many times would be the national picture, but the regional and the local contexts could be missing. And so this is also one gap that you can fill, and perhaps maybe link it up with some of the meetings also of local government officials. Like, I think there's an association of LGUs, local government units at different levels, provincial as well as cities and municipalities. So those would be good venues to share your work and also get feedback from the various stakeholders that you would be able to encounter in these venues. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mala. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. I put in the chat the paper I mentioned earlier of What Is This Case, so Christian Allen's paper. I don't know whether it's open access or not, but if anyone wants to email me, I'm happy to send it to you. And that is a paper that kind of addresses your question, Elson, and the faculty's question about, how do we do this process of communication of the very specific and seemingly kind of maybe idiosyncratic to a wider audience. And it's partly how we write it. I think it's partly where we write it. There are sort of Philippine journals, there are regional journals, there are generalist journals and so on, and obviously they will pick up on different audiences. I'm sort of repeating myself here. It's also whether, this was Mala's point, sort of can you build in, if you like, this material into thematic debates. So I don't know what the extension project is about, but there are presumably extension project debates which cross Latin America, Asia, Africa. I guess there will probably be a conference on extension. I guess this is agricultural extension work about, how do you do extension? And that would then bring this case to people working in other parts of the world. So I think if there is a good side to COVID, one of them is that we've got much more used to this sort of engagement. And I think actually there is much more communication than there was 2 years ago, when we were all kind of in our little cozy, you'd go to conferences in Amsterdam and Tokyo or whatever, and if you didn't have the money, you couldn't attend, and no one was online, and there were no hybrid events. And now there are lots. So I think, if there is something from an academic point of view that's come out of it that's positive, is that we've got much more used to sharing across time zones and geographical contexts and that sort of thing. So I think if you like, the opportunities to communicate in sort of real time, like we're doing right now, are much, much greater. So, but look, it's come to what I said earlier, maybe don't go to the places you normally look in order to try and find, there must be an extension audience out there, people working in agricultural extension, who are thinking about just the challenges that you're thinking about in Davao, but they're doing it in Mozambique, or they're doing it in Suriname, or wherever it is. And that would be fascinating to be able to do. And then I think you get new lines of cross-communication, which are probably a bit different from the ones that you're used to. And so I think there's a kind of set of, where you publish, how you convert the specific into the general, and also are there, in terms of where you go for your conferences, thematic, less regional, and less disciplinary, more interdisciplinary, those are all options that are available. And maybe you don't need to leave Davao in order to engage with those debates. And that's new.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. I realized we're a couple of minutes over the time that we're supposed to end. But I think we've had, and with this particular question, I think has sort of brought us back to where we started, which is, how do we write for different audiences, but also that division, or sometimes the separation between the policy-oriented and sometimes government-facing or various other stakeholders-facing, as opposed to the academic publications and ways of communicating that we have. I just want to give you a massive thank you to both Jonathan and Marla for your time and for sharing your experiences and your insights on the topic. Also, a huge thanks to all the people who've attended, both within the Zoom meeting and those online watching the live streams, and especially for your questions. Without those, we wouldn't have been able to actually get some of the other discussions out that we might not have captured in the first half of the session. So huge thanks to that, and a huge thanks to X and Elson and DNSC for organizing this and for giving us this opportunity. So just want to say a huge thank you to everyone involved. And I believe we'll probably have one more session in this series, but just an opportunity to give Marla and Jonathan to say some final words, if you've got. Yeah.
I was just going to say thank you. Thanks, X, for inviting me to contribute. It's been great fun, good way to start a Friday here in the UK. I mean, I know many of you are probably ending your Friday, but it's been very interesting. I always enjoy these sorts of discussions, so it's a pleasure. And thanks, Gunjan, for chairing it so professionally. And nice to see you again, Marla.
Thanks very much. It has been a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon and also to hear from you. I also enjoyed the questions from the participants, and I wish you well. I wish everyone well. Also, just carry on.
Thank you once again to everyone online across, Zoom, live streams, Facebook, YouTube, and yeah. Thank you so much for the discussion, and we look forward to hopefully seeing many of you for the fourth session that we will hopefully organize in a month's time. So do keep track of on our various Twitter pages, etc., for updates on what the next session would be on. So thank you ever so much to everyone, and have a good day out or evening, depending on where you are in your time zone. So thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Recording.